Good morning. Marge, am I on? Does sound like I'm on? Okay. Not like I was shouting in the other room, because that really seemed on to me. This doesn't seem quite as on. Okay. Don't say anything bad about Chicago in this room today, because there are a lot of Chicagoans here. My younger brother, Ken, who lives 100 yards away from us in Timber Ridge, is also here. And Dave has brought quite a crowd from Holland and from Chicago to hear about him. Many of you know I'm also a native Chicagoan, but I've never considered myself a real Chicagoan. Dave is a real Chicagoan. He loves that city. He's done so much for that city in so many different roles that he's had. My brother Ken and I first got to know him, I think, during a youth retreat or two that he led for us. Dave was one of these wise men, and my brother Ken even remembers spending at a retreat, staying up all night, talking to Dave, and Dave, imparting all kinds of good words for him. My wife Cindy got to know Dave well when we lived at Trinity for 3 years, where she was a residence director and Dave was the dean of students. And when Dave took 1 year leave, Cindy actually helped fill in that role of dean of students for Dave. I've gotten to know him over the years in a writing capacity. He writes a lot in the Reformed Journal. He's a terrific storyteller. There's always a sort of a light tone, but with a lot of deep wisdom coming in the story as well. And recently, he has written and now published this week a great book, and I have read it a couple times actually. It's called Green Street in Black and White. And this means a lot to Chicagoans, and it means a lot to the Hiskises, because our dad was born on Green Street. I'm not sure if you knew that, Dave. And there's another person here who will meet you after the talk who lived down the street from you on Green Street. But Green Street is in the neighborhood called Inglewood in Chicago. And this terrific story, this novel, is set in the summer of 1962 in Inglewood. And it's a powerful story of the Christian Reformed community that lived there at the time, of some of the racial problems arising in that city. And the book shows how families in Inglewood and how the church and the school went through that change. It's a terrific book. I'll just read you one blurb from the back, and then I'll let Dave take over. This is from Hugh Cook. Green Street explores two powerful and basic themes: a young man's difficult journey from childhood innocence to maturity, and his experience of the damaging results of racism, involving fear, hate, and loyalty, and destructive allegiances. Larson conveys these themes with understanding, sensitivity, and honesty. They will be on sale after the talk as well, in case you're wondering. Dave, welcome. Thanks for coming. And Dave's wife, Sally, is here as well.
I'm kind of blown away by in addition to the ones I paid to be here, this is really good to see. This is the first stop actually on the book tour. It could be the last, but glad you're here. And here's what we're going to do. I'm going to give you a feel for the context, the origins of this story, the setting. I'm going to read a couple chapters in and through it, and I hope you get a feel for what it takes to go through a process like this of writing a novel. And then we'll have some time for questions and discussion. I'm going to start by reading the dedication. For my parents, Alf and Marion, and sister Karen, who lived and loved through it all. I have at the beginning of the book 3 quotes, 2 from James Baldwin and 1 by Yogi Berra. See if you can tell the difference. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Children have never been very good at listening to their elders, but they have never failed to imitate them. You can observe a lot by watching. You know who did that one, right? All right. My original intention, or maybe pretension, in thinking about writing this novel was to do an urban To Kill a Mockingbird. That's kind of me, Kill a Mockingbird? No, it's more like 50 Shades of White Flight. And the novel is called what's called an autofiction. It's a combination of autobiography and fiction. It's a vehicle for telling the story, as Mark said, of the early 1960s in the neighborhood of Chicago called Englewood on Chicago's South Side. This is a picture of the main intersection of Englewood, 63rd and Halsted, the busy commercial part of it. This is Halsted Street that runs north and south. You can take Halsted all the way to downtown Chicago and far south past Roseland if you know Chicago area. This was the commercial district, and people were always drawn to 63rd and Halsted to go to Sears. We lived one block west, a half block west on Green Street in Chicago in Englewood. Like many urban areas at the time, like Grand Rapids and Detroit and Milwaukee and maybe Holland, there was this period of white flight, people moving out of established neighborhoods for one reason or another, usually involving race. In Chicago, it was because there was the great migration of African Americans from the South, fleeing the South from Jim Crow laws and persecution. And then while they were there, buildings were torn down. The expressways were put in. There was no housing available. They had to move somewhere. So there were real estate contracts, illegal contracts drawn up to keep blacks out. All of that is explored in the novel. And so the dynamics of church and Christian school, as well as family decisions. This really started when I got to be an adult with kids in the house, and I thought back on those days, and I thought, would I have done anything different than my parents did if I had lived in this situation? Would the church be any different today, the Christian school any different today in that kind of situation? Or we're going to repeat this stuff all over again? So it's meant to capture the complexities of integration, racism, and solidarity, all through the experience of Eric Peterson and the Green Street Boys, his small gang of friends, and Magnus, his father, and Fenna, his mother, prototypes of my parent. So I've read the dedication, and I think the best way to get you a little involved in what it takes to write it is to have some of the acknowledgments read to you, because then I get to say Mark's name. The gestation period for this small novel was nearly a lifetime if one considers having lived through much of its story and now being decades removed from it. It wasn't until the 1990s when I expressed the desire to write something that my wife, Kathy, who died of cancer in 2015, encouraged me to start the process, suggesting the form of a memoir. After early experiments seemed less than satisfying, drafts of opening chapters in novel format shared with some friends affirmed the change in genre. Along the way, I reflected on a research paper I co-authored with Ron Nydam, who was, for a time, professor of pastoral counseling at Calvin Seminary. Well, we were students together at Calvin Seminary. We studied the movement of churches and Christian schools from the racially changing neighborhoods of Englewood and Roseland to outlying suburbs. That research uncovered systemic efforts in real estate practices and governmental policies designed to keep blacks from moving into white neighborhoods. We also discovered documents from church councils and school board minutes which reflected veiled and outright racist attitudes. And all of this was to become part of the atmosphere for the novel. And a turning point for me came with my participation at a Scriptoria conference, a workshop for aspiring writers co-sponsored by Calvin University, Aquinas College, and Cornerstone. A chapter of this novel was workshopped in front of peers who were also writing, and Hugh Cook, who was also mentioned before. And I received what I thought was affirmation enough from the classmates and Hugh to complete the novel. And Hugh was very instrumental. If you know him, a great guy. I never envisioned at the outset that a novel is a communal effort. It's not, I had this picture of you just sit off somewhere and write a novel. It's a communal effort. Many were involved in the process, for which I'm deeply grateful. Lou Seitzma, maybe some of you know him, brought his knowledge of White Sox history. Mark Hiskus persuaded me that I was writing a story that should be told. A number of black pastors in Chicago enlightened me into the dynamics of race relations. I had friends I grew up with who were members of the same church in Chicago. Sally and I took them to lunch, and we just sat for hours telling stories about growing up in Englewood. My pastor, Roger Nelson, a master preacher and storyteller, inspired me in affirming the arc of justice, which is the telos of all creation. My sister shared memories along the way, correcting me at times. Our children and their spouses found ways to encourage me with their interest in the project in response to earlier drafts. Editor Jeff Monroe, how's that for name dropping? Editor Jeff Monroe and I spent many hours on Zoom calls, and I look forward to each one. His blend of humor, insight, suggestions, and sheer interest in the subject matter and time period shaped this novel for the better. His attention to detail and historical accuracy, especially when it came to baseball, was a wonder to behold. The fact that we shared a similar faith tradition and hope for the future made the editing process a pleasure rather than a burden. Jeff and I wrestled over the title. I thought I had a real winner. Gone with the Wind. He said, no, that's been done, Dave. And then I got an early morning email from Jeff. He had awakened in the middle of the night in a dream. He said, I've got it. Green Street in black and white. I said, I like that, Jeff, and that's the title. And then there's Sally, my wife, combination cheerleader, queen of the commas, and savvy censor of tone and character and conflict. She was always interested in the project and supportive of the time it took to complete. An avid reader, her suggestions always resonated with my hopes for the novel. Couldn't have done it without her. So, let me show you a few more slides and set the place for the novel. The next picture is actually the home we grew up in. Karen, kind of misty-eyed now. So this is a typical Chicago bungalow. There is a basement with a tank for oil, heat, and some poles that we had boxing matches in and roller skating parties. A main floor that had no hallway. You walked in the front door, and that was a living room, dining room, master bedroom, just at a door, no hallway, and then 2 more bedrooms behind, and a porch and a tree in the backyard that we had this makeshift tree house. But these kinds of homes were, and some still are, all over Englewood and Roseland. It's a typical Chicago bungalow. So the next picture shows Second Englewood Christian Reformed Church. This is a gathering of all the smokers. And right behind it was a new building built called the Parish House. Picked up on, I think, the parishes of Catholic churches. There's a phrase in Chicago, which parish are you from? And all Protestants knew which parish they were from because that defined the Catholic Church. I always thought it because that's where catechism classes were held, that parish was spelled P-E-R-I-S-H. The next picture is Englewood Christian School on Sangamon, 72nd and Sangamon. Swartz candy store and grocery store was next door. Playground around the back and on the side. And that plays into the role because the part of the novel is about what is a Christian community doing in these kinds of racially charged times. Next picture shows my parents. I look like my mother. My sister looks like my father. She has a uniform just like that. And I, a nursing uniform. So I'm going to now read chapter 1. And it talks about the Green Street boys. And these are boys all of either 6th or 7th graders in the summer of 1962. I think I'm going to burst. Frank Bertoli looked back and grimaced as he hustled across the street toward Old Man Finnegan's front porch. Frank, a.k.a. Catholic Frank, a.k.a. Francis A. Sissy, was mercilessly picked on by the other members of the Green Street Boys. His crime was simple. He was an idolatrous papist. If pressed, none of the Green Street Boys could actually define that term, but it didn't matter. They'd heard their parents whisper those words and knew that that made Frank different. Plus, Frank had thick black glasses and a squeaky voice. Worse yet, he was in love with Annette Funicello. All the Green Street Boys admired Annette's perky breasts, but what chance did Frank have with her? He had the good looks of Alfred E. Newman. Still, he was a Green Street Boy, and initiation into the Green Street Boys was renewed annually. Today it was Frank's turn. An hour earlier, he drank a quart of Pepsi. Now, as the overhead roar of a plane approaching Midway Airport provided cover, he pulled aside the loose latticework beneath Old Man Finnegan's front porch and quietly squeezed under, being careful not to bump his head on the wood above. Taking a long leak under Old Man Finnegan's porch was the first step in the initiation process. Eric, Eddie, and Pete, the other Green Street Boys, hid behind parked cars in front of the Clemens house across the street from Old Man Finnegan's, keeping watch. Old Man Finnegan was a neighborhood grouch, a widower with all the charm of a soiled sock. Rumor had it he parked a shotgun just inside his front door and wouldn't hesitate to use it on trespassers caught desecrating his property. Taking a long leak under his porch was akin to tango dancing through a minefield, and each of the Green Street Boys had imagined emerging from under the porch to find Old Man Finnegan in his flannel shirt, greasy jeans, and dirty red suspenders aiming that shotgun directly at him. After a minute, Frank rolled out from under the porch, grinning, and ran toward the others. They ran back across the street and climbed onto the Petersons' porch where the Green Street Boys hung out on summer days. I feel 10,000 times better, Frank said. Everyone had a front porch, a place to escape the summer heat. Nobody had air conditioning unless you were some hoity-toity on the Magnificent Mile or in a mansion on the North Shore. Green Street had front porches. God's air conditioning. And though adults ruled their porches after supper, the Peterson porch belonged to the Green Street Boys during summer days. The Green Street Boys didn't have a hierarchy, but by virtue of meeting on his front porch, the club belonged to Eric Peterson. Eric split summer vacation between the front porch and the treehouse his father, Magnus, had built in the three-pronged fork of a backyard maple. Magnus had secured a section of discarded plywood from the alley behind the house to serve as a platform and had nailed steps cut from a 2x4 to the side of the tree. A pail on a pulley held whatever Eric was reading at the time, biographies of heroic figures like Daniel Boone or Robin Hood, or Sherlock Holmes mystery from the local public library, the latest edition of Marvel Comics, or a smuggled Mad magazine. Treehouse was for reading and spying, and on his plywood perch, leaning against the thick branch of the maple and devoted to whatever the pail held, Eric visited other worlds. On most summer days, he would ascend and wait for his father to come home from work, unless the porch called to him for a Green Street Boys adventure. The Peterson porch was not very big, just large enough for hanging out and observing. This afternoon, it was full of the Green Street Boys. After they'd caught their breath, Pete said, "You know what comes next now, Francis." Frank squirmed as Pete pulled out a jackknife from his pants pocket. They all held out their middle fingers. Pete pricked Eric and Eddie's fingers, and Frank stuck his middle finger up, flipping the others off. "I don't wanna," he said. "You're such a little girl," Pete said. "I am not," Frank said. "Come on, Frank, we're bleeding here." "Stand still," Pete said, as he grabbed Frank's hand and cut his finger. Frank almost started to cry, but held it together as Pete then cut open his own finger. And the Green Street Boys stuck their fingers together. They were blood brothers for another summer. "What are we going to do now?" Frank asked, sucking the blood off his finger. "Game of war," Pete said. A Dutch immigrant who looked old beyond his years, Pete Koning was the biggest and strongest of the bunch, followed by Nux. How about it? Their games were often brought to a manly conclusion by Nux. Losers made a fist, extended their arm, and the winner got to whack the other's knuckles with the edge of a full deck of cards as hard as the winner could muster. The first to bleed was the big-time all-star girly loser. Frank hated Nux. I don't want to play Nux, Frank said. Well, I do, Francis A. Sissy, Pete said. Not today, Eric said. It's already amazing we got this far without Frank crying. Nux would be too much. My mom's inside and she'd hear him, and then I'd have too much explaining to do. I don't cry, Frank said. Quit making things up. You do too, Eddie Medema said. A slim kid who knew how to leverage his stroke. Eddie was the most forceful knucker among the Green Street boys. You cry more than Annette ever has. You almost cried just now when Pete cut your finger. I saw your lip quivering. It was not, Frank said. It's a miracle you didn't wet your pants at Finnegan's, Eddie said. It's a miracle you went to Finnegan's, Pete said. Pete rose, looked at Eddie and Eric, and said, maybe we should just take turns punching Frank. Stop picking on me. Frank screwed up his face, tightened his lips, clenched his fist, searched for just the right words, and raised his whiny voice. Shut up, nig, he shouted. Eric looked at Pete. Pete looked at Eddie. All three then stared at Frank with open mouths, stunned. What did you say? You heard me. Cursing was one thing, reserved for special occasions far from parental earshot. But a word like this crossed the boundaries of swearing, the norms that govern what did or did not give offense. This was a weapon. Most of the swear words in the boys' vocabulary brought them together. They were words friends said for a thrill, for laughter, or daring. This was different. The N-word had never been spoken by any of the Green Street boys, although all the boys heard it from adults when they weren't supposed to be listening. They knew the word was demeaning and belittling, yet they never threw it at each other. They had other words that did the job. This one carried power way beyond the normal names they called each other. Eric was Bones because he was skinny. Schnoz stuck to Pete because of his bent, large nose, and Eddie was Bucky because of his teeth. But this word, stunned, it was meant to mark someone as less than human. They felt it. Got your attention, didn't I? Frank said. I'm sick of being the big joke all the time. Sick of it. Enough's enough. He stomped his foot, sniveled, hitched up his sagging jeans, and marched down the stairs, heading home. He didn't look back. A stronger word didn't exist in their neighborhood. It was part of the glossary of the neighborhood, a tool of division, an emblem of hate, and one of their own had introduced it among the Green Street boys. Most people in Englewood, as in many Chicago neighborhoods, sought refuge on their porches at night because it brought a sense of calm to the surroundings, a still, enduring center for an increasingly confusing and tense world. The neighborhood noise of the day quieted, and gathering in view of your neighbors seemed the most natural thing to do. It was a place and time to check in with each other to see what the day had delivered. You could almost predict what would be said and by whom on the front porches of Englewood. A few years earlier, during the summer of 1959, when the White Sox took the pennant and Nellie Fox and Luis Aparicio were instant celebrities, housewives ventured their opinions about the chances for a World Series without regard to their husbands' heavily researched predictions. The night the hitless Wonders beat Cleveland to reach the World Series, everyone on Green Street sat on their front porches with their radios turned in and turned up in unison. Anyone standing in the middle of the street could have heard clearly the play-by-play. Between innings, Green Street echoed with the familiar drumbeat of the Hamm's beer commercial from the land of sky blue waters. When the last batter hit a ground ball to Aparicio, who then stepped on second and started a double play, there was cheering and shouting, followed by the noise of the fire sirens Commissioner Quinn had ordered alive. That summer, the summer of 1959, the White Sox were the talk of every porch on Chicago's South Side. This summer, the summer of 1962, was different. This was the summer of the N-word. It was spoken often, not only on Green Street, but throughout Englewood, and not just by Frank Bertoli. So I did some research on the way to this novel and came across the final edition, the 1962 edition of the Englewood Christian Flash, honoring the last class at Englewood Christian School, the ninth grade class of 1962. The Flash was honoring that class, and I was looking through it and came across a picture of the honor students, for example. My sister's on there. She's on there, honor student. I must have been sick that day. And I also You were sick too? Yeah. Thanks, Ron. I feel better now. I also came across this picture of the Englewood Christian School Board that made the decision to sell the school. And I read this paragraph. Now our enrollment is decreasing rather rapidly, so that for fall we considered it unfeasible to continue as we have. When the Chicago Board of Education offered us $110,000 for our school, we accepted. Our school will be used to educate children of our neighborhood to whom God has given a different color of skin. We pray that in the future, God may provide a way so that we may be able to witness to these people the wonderful grace of God as revealed in Christ. In the meantime, let us harbor no bitterness or resentment. If we do, we can no longer sing, "Red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in His sight," a song which has echoed often from the halls of our classrooms. There's a whole lot you could say about that paragraph, but I don't have to say it. I can see on your faces, you've thought it. And then I looked up at the picture of the board and I looked to see how many people I knew. And there's our father sitting down in the front row. And I don't know about you, but I never really talked with my parents about that move of our school and their part in it, what they thought about it. If you read the book and you figure that Magnus and Fenna are symbols for my parents, I think you'll see they weren't racist. I think we knew that. Long after we had moved to Oak Lawn, my dad, every Sunday morning before we went to church, would tune into the Gospel Jubilee Showcase on the Chicago TV station, sponsored by Sid Ordauer, a Chicago auto salesman, a Jewish person. He would feature a gospel choir from the Chicago black churches, and my dad was transfixed. On Sunday morning, he'd watch that as a way of preparing for worship. I think that said something about who he was. I also found more research about Englewood, and I just want to read this paragraph. From 1960 to 1980, Englewood's white population plummeted from 51,583 to 818, according to the Chicago Reporter's History of the Neighborhood. Not even ethnic cleansing in the Balkans achieved the levels of turnover that white flight did in Chicago. That's astonishing, isn't it? All right. I'm going to read another chapter. And what time do we adjourn? Noon? 12:15. Oh, good, good. Let me introduce this chapter, chapter 6. It's late summer 1962, and earlier in the novel, Eric had witnessed the beating and robbery of an elderly neighbor and friend, George Clement, who lived across the street. Eric saw the initial encounter from his treehouse. He had words with the assailants, teenage blacks, and his parents and younger sister, Magnus, Fenna, and Kristen, witnessed the incident moments later. The chapter centers on the ride in a Chicago police car with Mick O'Rourke, Eric's uncle, and Eric's growing awareness of race as a defining thread to his life and the life of his church and school community. Eric's heading for 7th grade. The beating of George Clement took place on Friday afternoon. This ride in the novel takes place Tuesday, the following Tuesday at supper time. And much of the action in the novel takes place on the front porch. You'll see it enters into this chapter too. And the porch functions as an image of how life was lived and changed for many, and what the porch could have, and what the church and school could have and should have been, a front porch of hospitality. Chapter 6. Moving right along. 1, 6. You'll be finished by noon. The doorbell rang just after the Petersons finished dessert the next night. The kids' favorite, lime green jello with sliced pears wobbling inside. Magnus was reading aloud the evening devotional, the story of Jesus casting a demon into a herd of swine, and Eric popped up to answer the door. His Uncle Mick was there, filling the door frame. Mick O'Rourke, Eric's Irish Catholic uncle from the old neighborhood where Magnus grew up, was on duty. His police cruiser was parked at the curb. He held his Chicago police hat in his hands and asked if he could come in. Eric brought him into the kitchen and offered him his chair, which he filled, his thighs and large rear end smothering the seat. Uncle Mick was so huge, Eric wondered how he could ever catch a criminal in a foot race or even a brisk walk. Could Uncle Mick even keep up with the pigs in the story Magnus had just read? Jeff didn't want that line in there. I insisted on it. Eric wasn't sure. Uncle Mick also had a particular smell. Day after day, his Old Spice aftershave fought a losing battle against the smell of Lucky Strike cigarettes and Jim Beam bourbon. Eric typically saw Uncle Mick at family gatherings like those in Grandpa and Grandma Peterson's small apartment off Garfield Boulevard on Sunday afternoons, and he always showed up for the raucous Peterson Christmas parties. He would bring sacks of White Castle hamburgers while the rest of the family feasted at the potluck buffet. Beer flowed, other Peterson's uncles would join Magnus in a makeshift barbershop quartet for Christmas carols, and Uncle Swede would tell his bawdy joke about the Virgin Mary. Mick always seemed expressionless, sullen, and sour, and sat by himself wherever he could find the roomiest chair. He'd married one of the Peterson sisters, yet never fit in with the rest of the family. His sole contribution to conversation was, "Hey, Eric, bring me another sack," whenever he ran low on the small, greasy cheeseburgers with grilled onions and pickles on soft steamed buns he brought with him. He'd then loudly make his annual joke, "They call them sliders, but it ain't clear if it's for how they go down or come out." You get a feel for Eric, yeah. Tonight, Mick was all business, like Sergeant Joe Friday on Dragnet, only wider and without the suit, skinny necktie, and fedora. "Those punks who jumped your neighbor are still out there," he said, addressing Magnus and Fenna. "Most likely doing their shit, pardon my French, somewhere else in the neighborhood. The report I read said the whole family got a look at him. Is that right?" Magnus and Fenna looked at each other. "So who got the best look at him?" Magnus, Fenna, and Kristen impulsively looked in Eric's direction. "So did anybody hear their voices, talk to them?" Uncle Mick was digging deeper. "I did," Eric said. "Only one of them talked when he flashed the knife." "Well, you're our best witness," Mick said to Eric. "Listen," he said, turning towards Magnus and Fenna, "I want to take Eric for a ride and see if we can find him. He got the best look, right?" All heads nodded slowly and slightly. "Good. There's some chance he'll spot him on the street." He paused, sensing through the unease in the kitchen that this took them by surprise. "If that's okay with you." Magnus hesitated, but this was police work and the request was coming from a family member. "You'll keep our son safe," Magnus said. "Nothing to worry about," Mick said. Eric thought it would be pretty cool riding in a police car through the neighborhood, even if it was with Uncle Mick. "How long will you be gone?" asked Fenna. "Maybe an hour at the most," Mick replied. Magnus jumped in. "And what if you find them? If Eric recognizes them, then what?" "Let's just say he'll do what's right by Mr. Clement. If he recognizes any of them, we'll cross that bridge then. Eric will be safe. I'll see to that." Magnus and Fenna nodded their approval. Mick rose, and the vinyl kitchen chair seemed to sigh in relief. Magnus said, "Be safe now, and do what's right." Eric anxiously followed his uncle to the front door. What if he did see them? This could be a chance to set things right for Mr. Clement. He'd be a hero. He stepped out on the porch behind his uncle and saw the blue and white police car with the gumball red globe on top. He could see the sirens attached to the frame behind the back windows. "We serve and protect" was the new motto of the Chicago Police Department, detailed on the side of the car. Eric felt as though he just scored box seats for a White Sox versus Yankees doubleheader. Who got to do this? Where were Pete, Frank, and Eddie? He wished they were here on the porch watching his triumphal entry into a Chicago cop car. He glanced and saw that the Bensimas were already on their porch and looking at him. Mick squeezed his body behind the steering wheel and motioned to Eric to sit in the front seat. Eric nodded towards the Bensimas, hoping they would figure out that from his placement in the car, he was helping in an investigation. He was, after all, the Sherlock Holmes authority among the Green Street boys. Uncle Mick pulled away from the curb without the sirens or the dome light operating. When the Petersons gathered on holidays, Mick was not in uniform. Now Eric soaked in every detail. His eyes were drawn first to the gun, cool gray steel in a worn leather holster. Eric wondered how often his uncle used it, if he'd ever shot anyone, and what it might feel like if he touched it or held it, but was afraid to ask. There was a Chicago flag with its 4 red stars on a white background, sewn onto his uncle's right sleeve, and a brass nameplate above Mick's right pocket that said O'Rourke, with a number below it. The chatter and static of the police radio clicked on and off as they headed down Green Street, reminding Eric of the times he and his dad sat on the porch late at night and found police calls on their small transistor radio. "Look," Mick said, "plan is to head up to Halsted to 71st Street, turn around and head south to 79th, go up and down every alley and street east of Halsted, this side of Hamilton Park. Just tell me when you see him. And you don't have to be 100% positive. Just somebody that looks like him." Eric was to finger, a police term he knew from Dragnet, one or more of the kids from the Clement incident. Then what? Would Uncle Mick arrest them right there on the spot? He pictured those kids handcuffed and angry sitting in the back seat behind him. And then what? Jail? Trials and testimony? Was he going to be a witness in court? And what did Uncle Mick mean about not being 100% positive? "Uncle Mick, you know it happened so fast," Eric said as the squad car slowly worked its way up Halsted. "I mean, I may be able to recognize the oldest guy, the one who showed me the knife. But the other two, I really didn't see them for that long. They were on top of Mr. Clement, rolling him over and looking through his pockets, and even the oldest guy." Eric paused. I'm just not sure. I know he was bigger than me, but that's about it." They turned around and headed south on Halsted. "Just keep looking right to left. I'll go slow." They drove 3 blocks before Mick said, "Look, Eric, alls we're asking you is your best guess. Kind of the process of elimination, understand? You know what they don't look like, right? Well, close is good enough." Close is good enough did not feel right. They covered Halsted and then headed down an alley to the east at a slow crawl, brought to a temporary halt by a garbage truck emptying 50-gallon drums. Then they stopped again for a backdoor delivery to a store facing Halsted. Then another stop. There were kids playing baseball with a spongy rubber ball. Eric had learned to play baseball in his alley. You had to hit to center field. Hitting to left or right meant the ball could be lost in a neighbor's yard or on the roof of some building. Eric looked at the game and wished he were out there. He saw a few kids he recognized from school and didn't know whether to wave or look away. Would those kids know he was on a police investigation or just think he was in trouble? He took his right arm away from the open window and slid down a bit in the passenger seat. They went over to Emerald and the 2 blocks and alleys farther east before Mick pulled the squad car to the curb and said, "Look, Eric, you got to think about what they did to your friend, right? You don't want him to get away with it, do you? Pay attention now. Understand? It's not that hard. Remember, close is good enough. I'll take it from there." As the squad car moved closer to Hamilton Park, the streets and alleyways became populated with more black people, adults and kids, playing on sidewalks and sitting on front porches, in so many ways a mirror image of life west of Halsted. Eric was struck by the similarities so nearby and yet so far from his experience. Did they sit on their porches after supper and wait for the sun to go down on warm summer nights? As the squad car slowly advanced, they came upon a couple of girls jumping rope. And when the girls saw the squad car, they dropped their rope and ran away. But he waved like they had in alleys off Halsted. People either just stared as the squad car passed or rose from their porch and went inside. Okay, we're in the thick of Coontown now, Mick said. Let me know when you spot someone that looks like one of them. I don't know, Uncle Mick. I just don't know. Eric looked out the window straight. I mean, what you're asking me to do, I don't tell the whole truth about a lot of things. I know that, but this is something different. This is bigger. What those kids did was wrong, but this feels wrong too. I can't just get some random kid in trouble. And even if I saw the right guy and knew it for sure, what if he came after me later? They know where I live. He folded his skinny arms across his chest. I don't see them, Eric said. The car kept driving and he grew more and more uncomfortable. Time moved slowly as Uncle Mick's police car crawled through the alley. They drove on in silence until finally Eric said, maybe you should just bring me home, Uncle Mick. After a few awkward seconds later, he added, please. Mick stopped the car and turned to Eric, staring at him without saying a word. Eric looked away, but Mick took his right hand and firmly redirected Eric's head. Hey, look at me, Eric. Don't screw this up. Eric could smell Mick's sour breath and clearly see his crooked yellow teeth. This is your chance to be a hero. Are you going to disappoint your friend George? Think about what he looked like, sucking dirt and blood in the alley. What kind of a friend are you? I didn't take you for a coward. Maybe I am, Eric said. He leaned back, but was unable to escape Mick's strong grip. Just bring me home, Uncle Mick, just bring me home. Unless maybe you want to stop at White Castle first? Eric said, hoping to lighten the moment. Mick pushed Eric away and started the car. He didn't say a word all the way to Eric's house on Green Street. There were still a few people out on their porches, and Eric saw Old Man Finnegan glaring at him as the police car approached. At the curb, Mick said, look, Eric, I hope someday you get some balls because you don't got them now. As Eric slowly opened the car door and gave his uncle one last look, Mick sneered, you have a good night now. Get your pink jammies on and crawl in bed with your teddy bear. Eric walked slowly up the short sidewalk with his hands in his pockets and avoided looking at his parents or sister who were out on the porch. He walked past them and went into his room where he slumped onto his bed and buried his head in his pillow. He felt like crying, but didn't. Instead, he replayed the ride over and over, thinking about what Uncle Mick asked him to do and how it didn't feel right. He couldn't stop thinking about the way the black people they passed stared at the police car, how things came to a halt as they drove by, and how he'd seen some parents gathering their kids into their arms when they saw the words, "We serve and protect." Well, that gives you a taste, I think, for the setting, for the process a little bit more, and a couple of chapters and what goes on inside it. In between, there are school board meetings, consistory meetings. A missionary comes from Africa, sends his 2 African kids to a Christian school. A lot happens. The Ku Klux Klan gets involved. It's a rip-roarer. But it also has a message. And I think it's a message one we still deal with today in many ways. So that's the story. It's time for questions and discussion. Mark, you want to?
You got a taste of what a great story this is. And not many novels, I think, have chapters that can stand alone as great stories. And that definitely is one. But the whole story is like that. Very powerful. Questions that you have? Careful.
When we first got married, we lived on 73rd, just off of Halsted in 1961. So,
Recognize the story.
Do you remember the address, Joe? Huh. Okay. Hmm.
Give more detail about you mentioned that you collaborated with some Black pastors. Can you give any detail of
Yeah.
some input that they provided to you that maybe you were aware of growing up at the time?
One, Reverend Rick Williams, who's a CRC pastor, said to me, look, there's no such thing as color blindness, you know, and it's wrong to think that way because I want you to see my blackness for all it's worth, and I want to see your whiteness. And once we can respect each other's backgrounds, culture, lifestyle, whatever, then we can talk about we're brothers in Christ. But until we cross that bridge, nothing real good's going to happen. That was Reverend Rick Williams, and that really stuck with me. And then Dr. Bob Price, who's a member of our church, Hope Christian Reformed Church in Chicago, has been working for years on racial reconciliation. So he read through the book too. And I had a good conversation with him and with Jeff Monroe about the word nigger. And he gave me a sense of how powerful, how hurtful that word is, what gravity it carries with it. And Jeff said, nobody publishes that word anymore. You can't use that word unless you're a Black author. So the N word is the abbreviation that appears in it. So, and was that helpful?
Yes.
Okay.
In 1963, I started a 2-year internship. I was a student at Western Seminary at First Reformed Church in Pella, Iowa. And I know that's a long way from Englewood. But somehow I had a contact with Reverend Harold Korver, who was at First Reformed, I believe it was First Reformed Church in Englewood. And we decided to do a youth exchange.
We have a young member of his church up here in the row.
Really? Oh. And we did a youth exchange. We had a large youth group in our church out in Pella, and they had a fairly large group in those days in Englewood. And they came out to Iowa, which was a big experience for most of those kids who'd never been on a farm before. And a lot of our kids were farm kids or small city kids. And then the next year we went to Chicago, and it was interesting to get the reactions of our students who, you know, in Pella, you could walk anywhere you wanted in 1963 and not worry about whether you were safe or if you're going to be beaten up or any of that kind of stuff. No racial issues particularly. And they came back. I think it was a learning experience both ways. Mm-hmm. And I was glad our kids did that. Mm-hmm. But that was quite an experience for them to come back. They were amazed at.
Kind of a bold thing to do at that time.
That was just 63 and 64. Yeah, right.
Ron Korver was at it was a Reformed church, wasn't it? On Michigan?
He was at the First Reformed Church in Englewood.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And Damon, yeah.
17 years later, I saw they should just buy it, property in Nebraska.
And I don't know whether you know this. But that church, when they moved to Orland Park, has since moved further west. And the joke we used to say was, we stopped at the Mississippi, you're all the way to Nebraska. But, yeah.
David, we need to use the mics because otherwise they can't hear on Zoom.
Dave, did you ever process this with your father?
No, never did. One of the deep regrets. Yeah, because, I know he worked with African Americans, native Chicagoan, probably in the service with them. I knew his heart, and I knew what he was proud of when, us as kids had some strong opinions about race relations. So, but we never had that discussion. I wish when I saw that, I was stunned. He was on the board when those decisions were made. And that flimsy excuse, they used to predict enrollment by baptismal records for a long time in Christian schools. That's how they projected enrollments, make budgets, all that kind of stuff. When people started thinking about leaving, They hadn't left yet in droves in 62, but they were projecting what was going to happen. So sold it to CPS and then had the nerve to say, and we know they're not Christians. We'll have to find opportunities to witness. Yeah. Back there.
Yeah, it's, excuse me, it's interesting and ironic that this sort of reaction, these incidents didn't end when people left the city. Mark and my parents moved twice, first to Evergreen Park, which is right near Oak Lawn, but then another 10 miles south. And I would say probably around 1969 or 70, we were involved in racially charged incidents in Oak Forest, which was a long way from where our parents started at Inglewood.
Yeah. Part of that is Chicago has, and the book mentions this at various points, a long history of race relations difficulties, racist policies, real estate, corrupt real estate owners who would hire black youth to make their presence felt in neighborhoods, to scare people into saying, we need to sell quick. So there's a whole history of race relations. There was a boy, and this was in the 50s, a black kid who was on a raft off of Lake Michigan at one of the beaches, Chicago beaches. His raft crossed the decided line between the Irish bathers and the black bathers, and he was stoned to death. Long history of gang rivalries and race-motivated kinds of things, as well as some evidence that Mayor Daley did the Dan Ryan Expressway around his neighborhood, because the clearest shot would have been right through Bridgeport. But got some engineers involved and displaced, they built high rises for tenement housing for blacks who were coming up from the South and just overcrowded in Chicago. But there's some evidence that there's some shenanigans going on with the Dan Ryan Expressway. Yes.
Dave,
So someone up here too. No. Next, after you, this gentleman up front. Yeah.
I lived on 74th Street in Green.
Whoa.
I'll talk to you afterwards.
Okay.
But my parents moved probably about 1960. And I'm wondering if in your research, was there any evidence that the leaders in the community knew about, for example, the migration and what was really happening on a big scale? I mean, all that we knew, our parents said nothing basically, although what we felt was the fear, lots of fear because of the violence and so on. So I'm wondering, did the leaders in the community at that time have any sense of the whole thing? All we knew, all we were told, when they come in, your neighborhood's going to deteriorate. That's it. And we saw it in front of our eyes. So I'm interested in your research on that.
There clearly were organizational efforts on the part of Englewood was an ethnic blend. There were Scandinavians, Irish, Italians, and you would make fun of the other ethnic groups. Whatever you were, you made fun of the other ones, right? But they all bonded together. Catholics, Protestants, whatever, bonded together in neighborhood organizations, euphemisms for how can we keep the blacks out, which led to some of these racial restrictions on real estate sales. The churches participated in that. They send delegations to that. Their discussions in their council minutes, it was disturbing to me. People I had admired as a kid, I read some of the comments made in church council minutes, and I thought, whoa, I guess I didn't know him. So there was some of that going on already at that time. One of the biggest motivators, of course, was we're going to lose property value. We're going to we have to sell our home below what it's really worth, and then the real estate would jack up the price for the blacks moving in. So there were a lot of games being played, systemic kinds of racist policies. The migration you refer to, I think, there are two migrations. I have a pastor call the whites nomads. You're not migrating, you're nomads. You're not going to stay in one spot ever. Witness what you referred to, Ron, with the church in 4 locations post-Englewood. So there was that kind of thing going on too, where churches just kept moving and moving and moving. Other migration was the Great Migration from the South in response to Jim Crow laws, post-lynching kinds of experiences in the South. So, yeah. Ellen?
I really enjoyed hearing your narratives of growing up in the late 50s and early 60s in a major metropolitan area like Chicago. I did myself as well. But my experience with Chicago was, of course, I'd been downtown and gone to Old Town and whatnot,
Sure.
in college age. But later on, I for business, I moved to Chicago. I moved to Pulaski in 115th,
Yeah.
a little town called Alsip.
Yeah.
Because everybody said, well, you got to live way out there. You can't. And then my brother-in-law worked, he came from Western Michigan, and he got a promotion to run a major department store, a discounter at 47th, 47th Avenue in Ashland Avenue and 47th Street.
Okay.
And so when I visited him and where he was working, he said, come down, but be very careful. And it was terrible at that area. He worked at a Zare discount store, and there was something going on every single day. And so going from 115th downtown, I worked in Westmont. I drove over towards that western side. But Chicago was just unbelievable in terms of anything roughly between 115th and downtown, you just completely stayed out of. And University of Chicago area, occasionally we went over there, but that was terrible too. And the white flight that had happened, I was amazed at your statistic of how the percentage, the population just completely.
Yeah.
I mean, it is like an ethnic cleansing but it's like in reverse or something. It's like nobody was really forced to.
Yep.
It was just the deep-seated prejudice that made people leave. I grew up in Miami, and you did not cross a street. It was terrible down there. And
Well, I don't want you to leave without hope.
yeah, oh no,
No, because my observation today, both in Christian schools, for example, and churches, I think we've learned some things. So I see signs of hope. We've got children who live in Bridgeport, Hyde Park, Bronzeville, and Lakeview. So they're in the city of Chicago. There's signs in schooling, public and Christian schooling, that we're learning to live together a little bit and understand it's a much better environment than it used to be. Schools are not moving. They're welcoming now. So, Bruce. And then, you got the last one, Bruce.
Well, I'm curious, you eventually moved out of Englewood. Did your parents ever give you a reason why they were moving? Why you were moving?
Yeah, I think it was to continue to be part of the community that they grew up in, part of the church and school community. They wanted to be, if they had not moved, the book talks a little bit about that. Would they have been shunned if they had commuted from Englewood to the church in Oakland, like what holier than thou kind of thing? So no, I don't think so. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, Ron. Oh, safety issues. Yeah. Safety was a big concern, and that's dealt with here too. Because I mentioned the Ku Klux Klan. I'm not going to give it all away, but that was based on research too. They had a presence in Chicago at that time. And so there was, they could stir the pot pretty quickly, but safety was a big issue. Safety, real estate prices, all of that. Now, I talked about the beating of George Clement in that police car ride, right? Yeah, he's sort of a surrogate for me. I was beat up in high school on the street. Yeah. And, go to school the next day and you're sort of a celebrity because you got beat up. You were chased by... I can bet it wasn't Francis Assisi. Thank you.
Wow.
Well, again, thanks for coming and your interest in the novel. We have paperback editions for sale today. The hardcovers are not out yet. And Sally and I will be at the table to help you with that. If you buy one today or from Amazon or another bookseller, please consider posting a rating or a review on Amazon. That helps spread the word and gives you a chance to be an author too. Don't be intimidated. Simply write what you describe about the novel after you've read it as if you were in a conversation with a friend. Easily done, but it helps a whole lot to get the word out.
And if Jeff were here, he would emphasize you're helping the Reformed Journal that way, right?
that's
By
true.
selling books.
Yeah, by
So-
selling books.
And let's hope that in this time we're living in where we want to sort of not talk about our ugly stuff in the past, that the church and the greater community can read this book and benefit from it. It is a great, great story. So thank you, Dave.
Thank you,
Really.
Mark. Thank you. Thank you.